Probably down in Northfield. Oh, yeah. I struggled with it. Don't we all? Yeah. No, I just have to, of course, opposed too, right? So golfers that remain are all funneling into courses. Yeah.
I think the lights are too bright. No, maybe a little bit. Yeah.
That's west, right? Yeah.
I love seeing everyone in their basketball gear. It's great. I love seeing everyone in their basketball gear too. So you can just clip this onto your shirt, like probably at the bottom of your buttons there. That would be great. And you can just clip it on and forget about it.
Okay, and this is the microphone down here, so.
If you can point it down, that'd be just fine.
Down is okay?
Yes.
All right.
Yep.
And
as long as you don't do jumping jacks.
And I don't have to turn it on or off.
Nope,
You
are
do
all
that.
set. Yep, that is all me.
Okay.
Make sure the light is on.
And now, and that is only talking to your.
Correct. Yep.
They're not hearing any.
Correct.
I don't have any amplification for these folks, right?
Correct. Yeah, it's small enough room that you're.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's not a problem at all. Yep.
Yeah. All right. Ready to rock and roll?
I am, sure.
Cool. All righty. Great. Well, I'll get us started here.
Okay.
Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Emily Krofcheski. Hey, Gary. We're so glad to have you here tonight. Thanks so much for coming out. And I just have a couple quick announcements before we get started. This microphone is to go into our YouTube feed back there. So that is my phone on the tripod there. So if you don't hear amplification, please don't freak out. Of those of you who are tuned in on YouTube, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat. If you have a cell phone with you and you are sure you put it on silent, go ahead and check again, just in case.
Oh.
I would really appreciate that. Thank you so much. and our speaker can do that too. Been there. In terms of upcoming events here at the Heritage Center, our most exciting event that we have coming up is the puzzle competition. We are going to be releasing 4 puzzles, and they are all unique images to our historic collections. That is coming up on December 14th. It's $10 for a 2-person team if you want to compete in that competition. There's going to be prizes. You can also have a 4-person team for $20. And the afternoon of that event as well, there's going to be casual puzzling. So there's no timer for that. You can just come and enjoy and put together those puzzles. So again, that's on December 14th. All right. So just to get started, I want to give a, still good?
I just moved the cord out of the way and it disappeared for a second.
No tap dancing.
But it's back now, so.
That's why we try it out. All right. To get us started, I want to give a quick intro to our speaker this evening. Marc Huguinin has been a basketball fan for more than 60 years, since his dad first took him to the local high school basketball team. The older boys were heroic to me, he remembers. I wanted to be just like them. Huguinin played basketball through high school and has remained a fan and became a writer and historian of Minnesota basketball. With his good friend Stu Thornley, who is at a basketball game tonight, I understand, he co-authored Minnesota Hoops, Basketball in the North Star State, published by the Minnesota Historical Society Press in 2006.
There it is.
Kevin Garnett on the cover. He was the historian for the Minnesota State High School League on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the state tournament basketball in 2012. After blogging about basketball for 15 years, he launched a comprehensive website and blog, North Star Hoops, where he is known to many as Sunny Day or Sunny. In addition to his interests in basketball and writing, Huguinin also enjoys golf, music, and pizza. He lives with his cat, also named Sunny, in Stillwater, Minnesota, a block from the St. Croix River. I also want to give Marc a shout out because he served on our Washington County Historical Society Board of Directors. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to him.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Emily, for putting this together and for that nice introduction. And thanks to all of you for being here. I like to say I've now published 2 books.
on Minnesota basketball, I like to say if I had $1 for every Minnesota book publisher who said to me that Minnesota is not a basketball state, meaning they weren't really sure they wanted to publish a book about basketball. If I had $1 for every time that happened, I'd have $10 anyway. But there's a rumor that Minnesota is not a basketball state, and hopefully we're going to prove that's not the case here tonight. And so the topic tonight is my second book, which was published recently, and it's called Some Very Clever Teamwork. And among other things, you'll learn tonight how I came up with that very clever title. The subtitle is How Basketball Transformed Youth Sports in Minnesota. And you may not be aware, this refers specifically to events that happened way back in 1913. So more specifically, the subject is how the Minnesota State High School basketball tournament came to be founded at Carleton in 1913. And drilling down even a little more, in other words, it's about the how and the why that tournament came to be. And now how and why are pretty common words, and they might sound kind of casual, but we can't go through the whole book tonight, of course. But the how is really kind of the Minnesota angle. It also covers the who did what. And so it's about people here in Minnesota who did specific things to bring that tournament to life. The why is really more of a bigger national story, because the tournament was the result of some very broad historical, social, cultural trends going on in America at the time. Things like industrialization and leisure time and the rise of public education and things like that we're actually not going to be able to get into all of that. I thought it was more appropriate tonight to look at the local history, by which I mean Minnesota, but also, by the way, as we look at the who founded the tournament back in 1913, Stillwater actually played a not insignificant role in the founding of that tournament, and so obviously we want to talk about that tonight as well. So we're going to talk mostly about the how and the who, but just to kind of close out that the why piece, and to say that, well, this was a national phenomenon. The Minnesota tournament was founded, and the committee, the authority that ran the tournament, were both founded in 1913. Well, across the country, many of these same issues that affected us here in Minnesota were occurring everywhere. And so in the 30 years after 1900, no less than 43 states in America founded a high school athletic authority of some kind. And 39 of those 43 states used a high school basketball tournament, just as we did here in Minnesota, as kind of the centerpiece of the creation of that sports authority that was meant to provide direction and teaching and training to the schools as to how to go about managing an athletic program. So the Minnesota experience is very much mirrored all over the country. Well, going back to 1913 and kind of starting that story, even in 1913, high school sports were very primitive. There'd never been a state tournament before. But even in 1913, people understood that a big school with more boys to choose from might have a better team than a small school that had fewer boys to choose from. So as the tournament arrangements were made and they were publicized, and as people became aware of the teams that would play in that first tournament, two teams came forward and came to be regarded as the favorites to win that tournament. One was Mankato. It was, after all, the biggest city and the biggest school in the tournament field, and they were also undefeated, at least as far as I can tell. There were no reports in the Mankato Free Press of any losses. And so Mankato was one of the favorites, and just for the record, because his name's going to come up again a little later, This fellow was their best player, and his name is Earl Kimball. But the second team that came to be regarded as a favorite to win that tournament was, of course, Stillwater. What we see here is, however, not the 1913 team. My friends here at the Historical Society and I could not find a picture of that 1913 team. So this is the 1914 team. We also, however, could not find a picture of the 1914 team with the names of the players in the photo identified. So we know who was on the team, we know who these players are, we just don't know which is which. Well, except for one exception, and that is the fellow in the middle of the front row with the basketball on his lap. I am 100% sure that that is Harold Gillen. He was the best player on the team both in 1913 and 1914. He was the captain of the team. And after he completed his education here in Stillwater, he went to the University of Minnesota and played basketball for the Minnesota Gophers. In 1917, he helped the Gophers win the Big Ten championship. And in 1918, Harold Gillen was named an All-American. So he became a very prominent player, and I've seen other pictures of him, and so that is Harold Gillen. Well, like Mankato, Stillwater was undefeated. At least there were no reports in the Gazette of any losses. And Stillwater was the second largest school and the second largest city that was in the tournament field. So Stillwater was also regarded as a co-favorite to win the championship. But in addition to all of that, the fact that Stillwater was at least co-favored has a lot to do with this fellow. His name, as you can see, is William Hollins, and in 1913, he was the superintendent of schools here in Stillwater, and he held that office through most of the decade. He was born in England, raised in Millbank, South Dakota. He came to Carleton to college and graduated in 1900. And in that year of 1900, he also played on the Carleton baseball team with another fellow, a teammate by the name of Fred Hill. And Fred Hill, as you will see, is a particularly fascinating character. Fred was born in Red Wing, raised in Morris, Minnesota, and he too, like Hollins, came to Carleton to college. And like Hollins, he graduated in 1900 and played on that 1900 Carleton baseball team. But unlike Hollins, it was actually Hill who was the star of that team. He was a left-handed pitcher of some note. But after he completed his education at Carleton, he went out east to the Hartford Theological Seminary, where he was ordained as a minister in the Presbyterian Church in 1906. Well, then he returned to Carleton as a professor of theology in 1907. Well, along with being a minister and now a college professor, he was also a sportsman of some note. He, of course, had been a good baseball pitcher. More than that, though, he was affiliated with the YMCAs, and we all think of the YMCAs now as somewhere you go for physical activity of some kind. Well, that goes back 150 years, and Hill was very involved with the YMCA movement at that time. And as such, he was an advocate for the adoption of sports in the schools as an extracurricular activity, both at Carleton and in Minnesota's high schools. And as such, he was the chairman of Carleton's faculty committee on athletics, which supervised Carleton's athletic teams. And he was also the chairman of the high school tournament committee for 4 years from 1913 to 1916. But there's more. When Hill came back to Carleton in 1907, he brought with him a wife. She was Deborah Sales, now of course Deborah Hill. And she was one of the richest women in America. Her father, Frederick Sales, had owned any number of manufacturing plants out east in Lynn, Massachusetts, and up and down the East Coast. In the linen business, he manufactured linens, he manufactured clothing, he manufactured yarn, he owned dye works, and so on. Well, and in fact, he was the founder of Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and was its first mayor. But he had passed away in 1897 and left his daughter a very large fortune. And when Fred and Deborah came to Minnesota, they were possibly the richest people in Minnesota. And so that was 1907, they arrived in Northfield. In 1908, Carleton got a new president, a fellow named Donald Cowling, and the Hills bought him a house right across the street from the Carleton campus, and it served as the president's house for many decades. In addition to that, they bought him a lifetime membership in the Minneapolis Club. Well, Cowling stayed at Carleton for 35 years. He became noted as a prodigious fundraiser, and the Minneapolis Club was his base of operations for his fundraising. And by the time he passed away some 50 years or more later, his membership in the Minneapolis Club was the oldest membership in the club. And again, it had been bought for him as a gift by the Hills. That was all in 1908. Well, in 1909, the Hills paid the cost of building a gymnasium on the Carleton campus, and it was named the Sales Hill Gymnasium for some reason. And it served as the home court for the Carleton basketball team from 1909 through 1966, and it was the site of the state basketball tournament, the high school tournament, from 1913 to 1922. And when the tournament, the high school tournament, was announced in 1913, it was also announced that the Hills would pay the travel costs of the high school teams because they were afraid that teams might not be able to participate because of the cost of travel. So I would hazard to say that Hill probably had some influence at Carleton, at least among the Carleton administration. If he supported a high school basketball tournament, clearly people would listen. But there's really more than that. This wasn't just Hill's brainstorm. Carleton at that time was one of, if not the first, college in Minnesota to offer a curriculum designed to teach young people to take jobs in the public school system. The public schools were fairly new at that time. And so they trained people to be teachers and administrators in the public schools, including in the secondary schools. And as a result of that, when the tournament was held in 1913 for the first time, more than half of the schools that participated had a superintendent who was a Carleton graduate. And Carleton's Dean of Students, Luther Weigel, was the president of the Minnesota Education Association that very year, 1912, 1913. And the MEA annual conference was held at Carleton in the fall of 1912. So Carleton was very plugged into what was going on in the public school system, in the secondary schools. And so I said Hill was an advocate of sports in the schools. That wasn't just a vague dream. He and his Carleton colleagues had direct contact with the high schools in order to exercise influence over that and other issues. And so that's a big deal. Secondary schools in particular were pretty primitive yet at that point. The first high schools in Minnesota were founded, I think, in the 1870s. By about 1885, I doubt that there were still more than about a dozen high schools in Minnesota, but by 1895, as you can see, the number of schools had grown significantly. And in 1895, in fact, the Minnesota legislature passed a law, and the state of Minnesota, for the first time, offered financial assistance to school boards that would create a high school. And so under that influence, you can see in the 20 years after 1895, the number of high schools grew by more than 2.5 times. Well, when the state began to invest money in the local school boards, they also created the office of the inspector of state high schools, and he would travel around to the high schools. He visited every high school every year, and he wrote fascinating reports that are just a great little snapshot of what was going on at those high schools, and most of them in small towns. So it makes just a great reading. But by 1913, and the inspector was a fellow named George Ayton, and in 1913, in his 20th annual report, well, you can read what he said. We have the most favorable high school organization that Minnesota had ever had up until that time. And in fact, in the quarter century after 1900, public spending on the schools increased tenfold. So you might say that Carleton, who'd gotten in on the ground floor, was training high school and elementary school teachers and administrators. It was riding a wave, you might say. And so meanwhile, at Carleton, by 1913, that president I mentioned, Donald Cowling, he'd already raised a lot of money. Carleton had built several new buildings and had upgraded its faculty, and they were ready now to begin recruiting students in earnest. And what that really meant is that at that time, the student body in most colleges was very largely made up of women. Carleton wanted to have approximately an equal number of women and men. That meant it had to get out and start recruiting a lot more men than it had had previously. So all of those threads came together then in 1913. On February 11th, Carleton announced that it was launching what it called an advertising program. It was really a student recruitment program. A philosophy professor named Leal Headley would go out to the schools and make presentations about Carleton. Just 1 week later, Carleton announced that it was forming a press bureau, and it would give students practical experience in working with the press and all of that, but it would also publicize Headley's program. It would publicize the Carleton Glee Club, which traveled around the state doing concerts, and it would publicize Carleton generally. It was just 2 weeks after that that Carleton announced that it would be holding the first state high school basketball tournament. Well, remember William Hollins, the superintendent of schools at Stillwater and old baseball teammate of Fred Hill. In 1939, Hollins was interviewed by the Minneapolis Tribune, and he remembered that in 1913, Stillwater had this great basketball team. Hollins wanted them to have a chance to prove how good they were. He approached Hill and said, Carleton should host a basketball tournament. Well, the next thing he knew, there was a basketball tournament. So he assumed naturally enough that he had exercised some influence. But as we've seen, the wheels at Carleton were turning rapidly in the direction of having a tournament. And it's probably very likely that Carleton would have done that, whether Hollins had said anything to Hill or not, though we'll never know, and Hollins never knew. Well, as I said, Hill then was the chairman of the high school tournament committee for 4 years. The tournament was held at Carleton for 10 years, and Carleton each year would have a banquet for the participating teams. Well, in 1916, at the fourth tournament, Hill stood up in front of the banquet, gave a little speech, and among other things he said, we admit that the tournament is held in part to advertise Carleton. Advertising is the thing nowadays, he said. And he's probably remembered for that more than for all the other things that he did. And so, returning to the 1913 tournament, you can see that the two teams that were favored, expected to win, did win in the first round. Stillwater, in fact, beat Madison pretty badly. And the tournament, as you know, is now 111 years old. That Stillwater-Madison game remains today the only game in the entire history of the tournament in which any one team failed to score a field goal. All of their points were made from the free throw line. So Stillwater was pretty impressive, at least in that first round. Well, the tournament had kind of a funky bracket that year. They had 7 quarterfinalists, and so of course somebody got a bye. Well, Stillwater apparently drew the long straw and got the bye. But in the second round, Mankato was upset by Laverne, but the fact is that their best player, you might recall, Earl Kimball, he hurt his knee in that game against Faribault and did not play against Laverne. So Mankato was out. Stillwater, meanwhile, didn't play its second game until the semifinals, and they promptly fell behind Mountain Lake 23-7 at the half. And as you can see, they rallied in the second half, but fell short. And so now the favorites were both out. Two of the smallest schools from the smallest towns in the tournament field somehow had made their way to the finals. And at 29-27, it was very widely reported to be a very exciting game. And so the first state high school basketball champions were the Foston Jack Pine Savages, as they called themselves. Well, today, fortunately, Foston's sports teams are known as the Greyhounds, but back then they were the Jack Pine Savages. Foston was founded in about 1885, and at that time, there were many more Native Americans in that area than there were white people. And so the economy of Foston for maybe the first decade or so was very largely based on selling goods to the Indian reservations and to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so they were the Jack Pine Savages. Their best player is over there on the left, Ralph Movold, who went by the nickname of Curly. A few years later, he became a basketball coach at North Dakota State, which in those days, however, was called North Dakota Agricultural College. His little brother, Leo Movold, is in the front row there holding the basketball. He was the 6th man or the substitute, though he did not play at all in the tournament in any of the games, though in later years he became the star and was probably a better player than Ralph by the time he finished up. So Foston's win was, of course, regarded in all of the media reports as a complete surprise. Again, it was one of the smallest schools from one of the smallest towns. It was also the smallest team by weight in the tournament. Now, you'll be surprised, I think, to know, as I was surprised to learn when I read the newspaper reports of the tournament for 1913, then 1914, then 1915, and so on. It was 1930 before any of those newspaper reports ever cited the height of a player and intimated that a taller player might have an advantage over other players. Only in 1930. Up until then, it was generally assumed that a heavier team had an advantage, as you might expect in football, for example. So Foston's win was considered to be a complete surprise. Secondly, all of the newspaper reports mentioned Foston's fancy ball handling, their passing, their teamwork. It may have been just one newspaper that used the phrase, "some very clever teamwork," which of course is the title of my book. But that was not just a generalization, it was a reference to a very specific thing. Excuse me, I need my copy of the book right now. It turns out that Foston High School burned down on February 5th, 1913, exactly 2 months before the very day on which Foston won the state championship. And as a result of that, none other than our old friend William Hollins stated in that 1939 newspaper interview with the Minneapolis Tribune, Hollins said the following: Boston came to the meet with an unorthodox style of basketball. The team didn't have a gymnasium. It had burned down. It had to practice in a small classroom, and these boys were forced to devise a revolving style of play, Hollins said. They passed the ball around while running in circles and introduced this style of game at the tournament. Their fancy ball handling bewildered their opponents, as you can imagine it would, right? And so that was what was meant by some very clever teamwork. And I thought that some very clever teamwork was a nice metaphor for the collaboration of the Carleton faculty and administration with their friends and allies and alumni who were working in secondary education around the state of Minnesota. And so that, my friends, is where the title of the book came from. Well, along with being a complete surprise and being the result of some very clever teamwork, there was one newspaper report that I found very interesting. This, again, is way back in 1913. One newspaper said, Boston's championship is all the more remarkable when you consider that they did not even have a coach. Well, that's very interesting to me because in future years, a fellow came forward and claimed that, in fact, he had coached Boston in 1913. His name was Dobie Stadsfold. He was a graduate of Boston High School in the class of 1909. He never played basketball at Boston because the first boys basketball team in Boston was put together in 1910. And yet, despite that, when he went to the University of Minnesota, he played for the Minnesota Gophers. Now, that only happened in his third year at the U, and again in his fourth year at the U. He then he graduated, he went home to Boston. He was elected the Justice of the Peace in Boston in that off year. But then he came back to the university in 1915 to attend the law school. And because he'd only played 2 years of varsity basketball, he could play 2 more years, and he did as long as he was enrolled in school. And so he played for 2 years as a law student. And I've already mentioned that the Gophers won the Big Ten championship in 1917 with Harold Gillen. Well, Dobie Stadsfold was his teammate. In 1917, Stadsfold was named an All-American, and in 1918, Gillen was named an All-American. Well, from there, Stadsfold went on to coach West Virginia for 15 years. And then in 1935, having been let go in West Virginia, he was footloose. He came down to the state tournament, and he was interviewed by a Minneapolis Tribune reporter. This was 1935. Hollins was interviewed by a Minneapolis Tribune reporter in 1939. And in 1935, Stadsfold claimed to have coached Boston at that 1913 tournament. Well, here's Dobie in later years, and I'm here to tell you that he did not coach Boston in 1913. Now, whether, in 1935, he was still only 40-some years of age, 45, 46 years of age. But whether he had a bad memory or maybe he was a glory hound, nobody knows, and we can't ask him anymore. But I can tell you he was not at Carleton in 1913 with that Boston team, and here's why. Dobie was the son of the richest man in Boston. His father, Seaver Stadsfold, owned the lumber mill, and he owned the flour mill. And he was the chairman of the school board for 32 years. So he was the most prominent man in Boston, and his family, of course, shared in that prominence. And so the local newspaper, which was called the 13 Towns because it served 13 townships around Boston, it covered the comings and goings of the Stadsvold family virtually weekly for 35 years. And so in the school year of 1912-1913, we know the following things about the Stadsvolds. Dobie and his brother Sidney and his sister Stella were all students at the University of Minnesota. In December of 1912, they came home for the Christmas holiday, of course. And on December 30th, Sidney and Stella and their other sister, Millie, were all elected as officers of the Boston High School Alumni Association. They then returned, that is to say, Dobie, Sidney, and Stella returned to the university shortly after that date. Then on January 24th, their mother, Minnie, went down to Minneapolis to visit her children, and she stayed for several weeks. Well, while she was there, the school burned down, and Seaver, of course, was the chairman of the school board, and so he was reportedly busy from dawn to dusk for several weeks getting the school back in operation in different rooms all over town. And whether Mrs. Stadsvold stayed in Minneapolis a little longer than expected, or maybe shorter, or maybe just stayed as long as she had planned, we don't know. Eventually, she came home in any event. And on the very day that she came home, Dobie was reported in the newspaper to have been injured in a basketball game against Purdue. The Minneapolis Tribune said he had injured his knee and that it was a severe injury and he would be hospitalized for some time. But a couple days later, the Stadsvolds got a letter from Dobie that said, no, it was my ankle, not my knee, and it wasn't very serious. And all of that was reported in the local newspaper. Well, on March 15th, Dobie, Sidney, and Stella again came home from the university, this time for spring break. And it was just 2 days later that Boston received its invitation from Carleton to play in the state tournament. So that had to be a pretty exciting time in a small town like Boston. And during that very same week, Dobie read in the Minneapolis Tribune that, of course, his family subscribed to and which was delivered to their house in Boston. He found out he'd been named the captain of the Gopher basketball team for the following year. And again, this was all reported then in the local paper as well. Well, on March 25th, the three Stadsvolds returned to the university, returned to Minneapolis, back to school. It was exactly 1 week later when the Boston basketball team left to go to Carleton. And the local newspaper reported that the entourage that went to Carleton was, of course, the 6 players, and we just saw their picture, and the superintendent of schools, W.J. Hoover. Did not mention anybody else traveling with the team or being with the team in Northfield. And considering that the comings and goings, I mean, the Stadsvolds couldn't really burp without it being reported in the local paper. And so if the paper did not say that Dobie was with the team in Northfield, it's because he wasn't there. And that is what I've concluded from everything that I was able to find. So I thought that was a pretty good story. There's a chapter in the book about that. But you can skip over that chapter. You've now heard the story. So, but in that 1935 newspaper interview, Stadsvold also informed the Minneapolis Tribune reporter that the tournament had been founded by a fellow named Claude Hunt back in 1913. And I guess I'll go ahead and spill the beans. Stadsvold was also very confused about that. He thought he was in Northfield in 1913. Well, he wasn't there, and so he had no way of knowing that Hunt was not there either. But this story that Claude Hunt, who, by the way, was a football coach and athletic director at Carleton a little later on, the idea that Hunt had founded the tournament was published in 1935. It immediately became the gospel. And Hunt was mentioned as the founder of the tournament many times in the press over a period of 70 years. In 1957, the Minnesota State High School League honored him in a little ceremony on the Williams Arena basketball court at halftime of one of the state tournament games and gave him a plaque which said very specifically that he was the father and the founder of the state tournament. And he was honored again similarly in 1963 on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the tournament. And most recently, he was named as the founder of the tournament in an article in the tournament program in 2003. So, as you heard earlier, my first book was Minnesota Hoops. And again, it was co-written. I co-authored it with my friend Stu Thornley. And one of the things I wanted to do, I wrote about the high schools in this book. One of the things I wanted to do was I wanted to understand, well, who was Claude Hunt and why and how did he go about doing that? I wanted to write that up in this book. So I went down to the Carleton archives, and the archivist brought me his file. And I thought, well, this is a skinny file for, I thought this was a really important person. And I opened it up and I went through it. Well, Hunt was not in Northfield in 1913. He wasn't there. So the idea that he had founded the tournament could hardly be the case. And the archivist then said, well, you should read the campus newspaper for 1913. And all of the information we saw earlier about Fred Hill and about the founding of the tournament in 1913, it's right there in the campus newspaper for anybody to see. But after 70 years, I was the first person to ask the question and to look into it and to find that here we've believed something for 70 years that just can't possibly be true. And so we wrote it up in the book, and now it's out there. Anyone who wants to know can find out that it was really Fred Hill and not Claude Hunt that founded the tournament. Now, I'm sure if you stopped people down on the Nicollet Mall and said, who founded the state tournament? Well, nobody knows, but at least it's out there, and now there are another 20 or 25 people who know the truth about that story. But in the book, and this is the very last paragraph of the last chapter of the book, so I'm almost done. But in the book, I asked the question, one might ask, is what I wrote, whether it really matters at this late date whether it was Hill or Hunt who founded the tournament, other than to those with a sentimental attachment to the truth. I don't know, is that sentimental? But, well, as a historian, no, I think that I have a very sentimental attachment to the truth. And still, does it really matter who founded the tournament? Well, I'm going to get into the why just a little bit here now. There was a debate going on at this time, a dialectic. A lot of people wanted to see sports in the schools. People came to believe that sports builds character. And that was a philosophy that was developed very deliberately to support the idea of bringing sports into the schools and encouraging people to get involved in sports. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But people came to believe that sports builds character, and wouldn't it be nice if we could bring sports into the schools, and boys at least. Now, people were very ambivalent about whether sports were good for girls or not. And that's a debate, of course, that didn't get resolved until the 1970s for another 60 years. But people thought that boys should have the experience of sports because in the schools, because after all, the schools were created to build character, and sports would enhance that character building experience of the schools. So lots of people wanted to see sports in the schools. But the dialectic was this. up until about 1915, the debate was mostly, or the arguments that you mostly heard were that sports builds character, and therefore every boy should be exposed to sports and should have the opportunity to experience that character building opportunity. That's not to say that prior to 1915 there weren't people who wanted to create elite sports teams, and the whole purpose was to win games. And so the purpose of introducing sports to every boy versus creating an elite team, which by definition would be just a few boys, and investing scarce resources in the very intensive training of the few versus spreading it out and investing those resources in ways that could benefit everyone. That was a very lively debate at the time. And so in the book, I continued as follows. Again, I'll start at the beginning. One might ask whether it really matters whether it was Hill or Hunt who founded the tournament, other than those, again, who have a sentimental attachment to the truth. But in response, one might ask, what if one wished to know today whether the state high school basketball tournament has met its founders' objectives? Well, one could hardly answer such a question without deciding first which of the purported founders you were talking about. Whether, in fact, the tournament was founded by a progressive priest who was an advocate for clean sport, which was a euphemism in those days for fair play, good sportsmanship, and who wanted healthy, wholesome exercise for every boy, or was it founded by a fellow who was an advocate for elite sports and who was known for the aphorism, kind of like Vince Lombardi, you know, winning isn't everything, it's the only thing, right? Hunt used to say, I'd rather hang on a rotten rope over hell than lose. And here's a guy teaching at a church-affiliated school, by the way. So I just think that's a debate that today we maybe should be more aware of, because that debate continues today. And I'll leave it there, because that I could talk for a couple hours just about that. That's how the book ends, and that's a little bit of the why. What were those intellectual currents that people were debating? Well, clearly the advocates for elite sports won that debate long ago. And so in 1935 to 1939, well, was it Hill, was it Hunt? Clearly Hunt was a better example of the attitude toward sports that was really taking over in America by that time. So, and just to finish where we began, which was here in Stillwater after all, well, Stillwater disappointed Hollins and undoubtedly disappointed themselves in 1913. But in 1914, of course, Stillwater won the state championship. Ironically, they'd been unbeaten in 1913 and 1914. They came into the tournament with 2 losses, though I was able to dig up that information. In fact, those 2 losses were to college teams. And then in the high school tournament, they won with ridiculous ease, as you can see. They won 3 games by an average of almost 29 points a game, and that remained the largest margin of victory for a state champion for 102 years. It was only in 2016 that a team won a state championship and won their games by a larger margin. So that team was indeed a very, very good high school basketball team. And as to Carleton's desire to bring more men to the school, well, the state tournament was an obvious effort to appeal to those strong young men. And by the end of the decade, there were, I think, 8 or 9 men who had played in the high school tournament at Carleton and then came and played basketball at Carleton. And of those 8 or 9 players, 2 of them were in fact from Stillwater. Mervyn Welshons played on that 1913 team, and Red Hollins, of course, is the son of William Hollins, the superintendent of schools, who's been a prominent player in this whole drama that we're talking about. So, so that's how and a little bit of why the Minnesota State High School Basketball Tournament was founded at Carleton in 1913. And so thank you everyone for your attention. And I'm going to try to answer any questions that you might have.
Just a little comment there on the Welshman.
Yeah.
When I coached a ninth grade Welshman.
There are still Welshans in Stillwater? Yeah. Okay, yeah.
I think the family had referred to interesting connections to early Stillwater.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes.
If my wife was here, she'd go like this and say, "It's not fair." Looking at your slide about the results of the next year.
Yeah.
Were there, is that complete results of the
No, that was just focusing on some of the teams that we had been talking about.
Yeah, because Boston looked like they were.
No, they all had to play. Stillwater, in fact, was the team who played one less game than everybody else to get to the semifinals. And actually, if your wife was here, I could tell her a story. Can I tell you another story? One more story? In 1914, you'll recall, Boston was the defending state champion from 1913. Well, the tournament committee, headed by Fred Hill, in 1914, they decided to organize the tournament based on congressional districts. And at that time, Minnesota had 10 representatives in the U.S. House. And so those 10 districts would be represented. Well, there were a couple issues with that, I guess. Whatever district it was up in the northwest end of the state, which included Boston. Well, the real problem was Boston lost 2 games in 1914. They lost to Thief River Falls and they lost to McIntosh. So the tournament committee told them, well, you got to play McIntosh, you got to play Thief River Falls. They did, and they beat them both. But that was only to win the championship of the northern half of that district. They then took a train down to Carleton, where they played Detroit Lakes for the district championship. They won that game, and now they were in the state tournament, having played 3 games in 4 days. Well, as I said, there were 10 districts, but Minneapolis never played high school basketball until 1919. There was never going to be a team from Minneapolis in the tournament. So the tournament had 9 teams. And so you only need 1 first-round game to get to 8. Well, Boston drew the short straw. They'd already played 3 games in 4 days. They drew the short straw. They played in that first, they were the only quarterfinalists to have played a game to get to the quarterfinals. They beat St. Paul Humboldt 23-21. And then in the quarterfinals, they drew Mountain Lake, whom they had played in the state championship game the previous year. They won that game 19-18. Well, now they had played 5 games in 6 days, and they drew Stillwater in the semifinals. Well, Stillwater had played 2 games, while Boston played 5. And so, of course, Stillwater won 32-19. Now, they may very well have won Stillwater regardless, but the people in Boston were, in fact, kind of upset about the way all of that played out. So you can share that with your wife. Yeah. Yes.
Well, I noticed the scores are much lower than typical scores nowadays. I'm wondering, were the quarters the same length?
Well, that's a really good question, and I've given that a lot of thought. The irony is, you'll see Stillwater scored 57, 32, and 30. Actually, in the period from about 1920 to 1940, the scores got even lower. And the point was that not only did Boston not have a coach, a lot of teams actually did not have coaches before about 1920, at least here in Minnesota. And left to their own devices, the boys, they ran and they jumped and they shot the ball, and youthful enthusiasm kind of carried the day. And so the average scores before 1920 were, very typically a winning team would score something in the 30s. I realize that's less than today, but in the 20s and 30s, teams routinely would win games with 15 and 20 points. Well, and this was the era when schools were hiring coaches. And coaches, of course, what do they want to do? I should ask the coach. But they brought more strategy to the game. And the strategy of the game in that era was that you won with defense. The key thing, though, is that after every basket, until 1937, there was a jump ball, just like a face-off in hockey, except you only interrupt the hockey game just a few times for a face-off. In basketball, a game that went 32-19, you were constantly having jump balls. And a player like Harold Gillen, by the way, was famous for winning the jump balls. A team that had a tall player or a good jumper could win the jump ball after every basket, and they could almost aspire to shut their opponents out. And that's exactly how that championship game of 30-4 occurred. Winona never had the ball, hardly. And so you could aspire to shut your opponents out, and some coaches kind of went whole hog with that as their strategy. And in fact, many teams back in the day would play what was called a back guard. On offense, one guard would stay back at half court so that the worst thing that could happen, which is a breakaway basket the other way, wouldn't happen. And so some teams were playing 4 against 5 on offense. And it's also true that back until almost 1940, the average team would shoot about 20%. And so that's why the scores are low. Partially, it was bad shooting, but partially it was the strategy of the game, and there was no shot clock by any means, was just to hold on to the ball and just keep the ball out of your opponent's hands as long as you possibly could. And so, yeah, the scores in those days were much, much lower than they are today.
Was the length of the game the same?
Yes, it was. Yep, 32 minutes, yeah.
And the three-pointer wasn't introduced.
Oh.
Was it?
I graduated from high school in 1968, and I had a hoop out in my backyard. I shot baskets all day long, every day, all by myself. So I never learned to pass the ball, or there were things I didn't know how to do, but I could shoot the ball. And if I had played after there was a three-point shot, I would have been a lot more valuable to my team, because in my day, I could hit a 20-footer, a 22-footer all day long. It was only 2 points. So you didn't do that. You shot layups. So, boy, what I would do to have had the three-pointer in my day.
87?
What's that?
1987?
I think Minnesota adopted it in '86. I think the ABA was the professional, the ABA was the first league to adopt it, and that was in the 70s, I think. But no high school or college league adopted it until about 1980. Minnesota, it was '86. I think the Big Ten, it was not until about '86 as well.
Well, I think George Mikan was pretty instrumental in creating the three-point shot. He was the first commissioner.
Oh, okay. I'm going to have to take your word for that, yeah.
Anyway,
yeah.
My question, though, is kind of going back like 15 more years from this book. Is there like a central figure, any person that kind of brought basketball to Minnesota? Or was it just barnstormers from Indiana?
No. So basketball was invented within the YMCA movement. The YMCA's, again, going back to the 1870s and 80s, for reasons that I don't think anyone really understands anymore, but suddenly YMCA started having gymnasiums and swimming pools, and their members, they were started, of course, the YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association. They were started as Bible study groups, but they brought in gymnasiums and swimming pools, and and membership skyrocketed all over the country. Well, except there was a kind of a little craze for gymnastics in the 1870s and 80s. But you know, you've watched gymnastics on television. Well, the average person can't even begin to imagine doing the things that elite gymnasts do. And so by gymnastics, you know, we're really talking about calisthenics. And let's be honest, calisthenics are boring, right? And so by about 1890, those gymnasiums were all empty. And the YMCAs had invested a lot of money and energy in promoting those. Well, the director of the YMCA nationally, he tasked one of his instructors, a fellow named James Naismith, and you've probably heard his name. He said, go figure out how we can get people back in the gymnasiums. Well, he went off, and a couple weeks later, he came back with basketball. Basketball then was promoted to the YMCAs all over the country, and it grew very rapidly. Well, in Minnesota, the first place that basketball was ever played was at the Minneapolis YMCA in 1892. And anywhere else that you found basketball in Minnesota, in the 1890s at least, somebody had learned the game at the Y, and then they went over to the University of Minnesota, or they went to their high school, or they went to church, and they founded teams at those other places, but it all started at the Y.
They have like a national conference that Naismith taught them, or?
Well, no. The YMCA's actually had an international training center in Springfield, Massachusetts. It's now Springfield University, but it was founded by the YMCA's, and the whole point was to train people to go out and get jobs at the YMCA's. And so that was where the game was founded. But the game was promoted essentially through the U.S. mail. They sent out the rules, and they sent out different information. They got a contract with Spalding for balls. Of course, you couldn't play it without the ball. And so it was promoted by from the Central YMCA in Springfield to the YMCAs all over the country. And as far as I'm aware, I think probably people played basketball in Minnesota before they ever did in Indiana. But that doesn't mean that over the years they didn't get a lot more gung-ho about it. Kansas was one of the places. Kansas City was a hotbed of YMCA activity, and it was one of the earliest places where basketball really became big. The Kansas City YMCA won a national championship back in the very early days. And so some of the places that we think of now as hotbeds of basketball, yeah, go all the way back to the very beginning. But in the very beginning, in the 1890s, I mean, Minneapolis would have been one of the 10 places where basketball grew the fastest. Minneapolis Central High School, by the way, had a great team around 1900, 1901, 1902. By then, the Minnesota Gophers were pretty good. In 1900, the Gophers went 10-3, and they beat the tar out of their major opponents. This was before the Big Ten, but they beat Iowa, Wisconsin, and Nebraska very badly. They lost 3 games to teams like McAllister, but they were 10-3. They were a pretty good team, and they beat Iowa like 42-15 or something like that. They beat Minneapolis Central 8-7, and Minneapolis Central had a star player who then came to the University of Minnesota and was the first All-American. But he was playing at Minneapolis Central High School at the very same time he was playing for the Minneapolis YMCA. And if a school wanted to play a game, he would play as Minneapolis Central with his buddies from school. If the team was not a high school or a school, he would play as the Minneapolis Y, and he would play with those of his friends. So, but it all started at the Y.
So this is probably another book, but when did women's basketball start? And having played intramural women's, game I played is nothing like what's going on now.
It was half court ball, 6-on-6.
Half court,
Yep.
2 steps, stop,
Yeah.
freeze.
Yeah.
It was 3-on-3
Yeah.
on either side.
Well, you are absolutely correct. That is another book. But
Okay.
I can tell you that there is a book. It was written by Marion Bemis Johnson, who still to this day lives in White Bear Lake, and Dorothy McIntyre. Does anybody know who Dorothy McIntyre is?
State high school.
What's that?
State high school league.
Yes, when the high school league, after Title IX, the high school league had to come up with girls sports, right? They hired Dorothy McIntyre, and she rolled out that entire program almost all by herself back in the early 70s. She is a legend. Well, she and Marion Bemis Johnson wrote a book. It's called Daughters of the Game, and I can tell you it's about 40 pounds. It's huge. And what they try to do is to cover every single Minnesota high school that had a girls team. Now, there was a lot of opposition, and it varied from city to city, to the idea of girls going out and playing basketball. And so in most towns, there were girls' high school basketball teams from about 1905 to maybe 1940, and in 1940 it all came to an end. But most schools didn't have a team throughout. They'd have a team for 5 or 6 years, and then it would disappear, and so on. There was a team in Grand Meadow down near the Iowa border. In the 1930s, they won 90-some straight games. They never did lose. Their program was disbanded, and that was the end of the winning streak. Anyway, their book covers, hopefully their goal was to cover every single high school that ever had a girls team, and there were probably 200 of them. But usually they'd be for 5 or 6 years, and then it would disappear, and maybe it would come back for a couple of years, and like that. Girls basketball, of course, came back in the high schools in the 70s. And of course now, I love girls and women's basketball. I almost like it more than boys and men. There's a little more teamwork. It's not pure, well, it's physical as all get out. It's terribly physical, but it's a little bit different games, just a little more finesse to it. And I think it's a great game to watch, both at the high school and at the college levels. And so, thank goodness that it's back.
A question?
Yeah.
That Hunt guy said he's getting credit for something he probably didn't do. Is anybody defending Hunt today? His family member?
I have never heard a thing. Never heard a thing. And well, by the way, I'm from Faribault. I grew up in Faribault. And when I was a kid in 4th and 5th grade, I had a paper route. Well, Claude Hunt was the publisher of the Faribault Daily News at that time. He, in fact, quit at Carleton as football coach and athletic director in 1931, because when he came to Minnesota initially, he and his brother-in-law founded the Faribault Daily News, and that, you didn't make a lot of money as an athletic director or a coach in those days, and so basically the Daily News supported a couple of families. Well, his brother-in-law died in 1931. Claude went to work as managing that newspaper and as the publisher of the newspaper. And I had a paper out under him, though I had absolutely no idea who he was. I didn't know him personally. And in about 1976, 74, 5, 6, and maybe Faribault High School had a great team. Marc Hugunin was the star of that team. Remember, he played football for the Gophers. He's now the rules guru for the PGA, right? He was from Faribault. He played basketball. Faribault was, and Mark Hunt was the guard. I never knew if he was related to Claude Hunt. And that team was unbeaten. And then in the very first round of the playoffs, as a number 1 seed, they lost to a number 8 seed. And that was the end of that. But my point was to say that there were Hunts in Faribault for at least some time after the 60s. But I am not aware, I have never heard from anybody who said, no, you got it wrong. Claude Hunt did this, or never heard a word in support of Hunt. Up in Boston, and I talked to their local historical society, of course, for some information. I don't think they're particularly happy with me for debunking the idea that Toby Stadsvold was at Carleton in 1913. don't think there are any Stadsfolds in Boston anymore, but I think a lot of the old timers in Boston probably knew some of the Stadsfolds. So I'm not sure they didn't invite me to come up and make a presentation like this. Let's just put it that way. You know?
Just mentioned, so the Faribault high school team made it 64.
Jerry is an old high school classmate of mine in Faribault, so we're going to talk about Faribault for a while, all right? No,
Well,
Faribault High finished second in 1965 at the state
65.
tournament. Yeah, 65.
And I was thinking you probably talked about the heroes. I mean, they had probably lived in your neighborhood, right?
Oh yeah, I knew all of those guys. Now, some of you guys probably know Mitch Onstad. Is that right? His dad, Jim, played on that Faribault High School team in 1965 that finished second in the state tournament. And I still make a point of going down to Lakeville South girls games because his daughter-in-law, Mitch's wife, is Angie Iverson, who coaches Lakeville South. And I see Jim at those games, and we sit and reminisce about the old days. Jim Onstad, by the way, in 65 in the spring, Faribault scored 19 points at the state high school track meet. Individually, Jim Onstad scored 19 points. So he was a hell of an athlete, and as is, of course, his son, Mitch. Mitch was Mr. Basketball here in about 1995 or 6, I think, yeah.
Did the high schools ever play in cages or with the ropes up, or was that just a program?
That's a good question. Back in the early days of basketball, you know, one of the really remarkable things is that as fast as basketball grew in popularity, nevertheless, it's true that Naismith's original rules were remarkably vague and incomplete, and all over the country, people had to invent rules to fill in the gaps to really be able to play a game. And one of the problems in the early game was, you know, your team had one set of rules, mine had a different set, and we'd play a game and we'd get into arguments about that. So that's a big problem. Well, one of the other problems was that in the very early days, Naismith's own rules said that when the ball goes out of bounds, possession will go to the team that touches the ball first after it's out of bounds. So the action out there was hot and heavy. Well, and so one of the solutions, well, the obvious solution was to say, no, the ball belongs to the team that didn't touch it before it went out. You know, that was only too obvious. In a lot of places, they put up a cage around the court, and that way the ball never went out of bounds. And of course, today, we hear basketball players referred to as cagers. What's with that? Well, that's because they used to play the game inside of a cage. Cages cost a lot of money, and they rendered that room inappropriate for lots of other things. So I do think there were, I'm going to say, a half a dozen cities in Minnesota that went ahead and put up a cage, but by and large, high schools, and especially small towns, it just wasn't practical to do that. And so again, I mean, somebody then came up with the idea that, well, when the ball goes out of bounds, it belongs to the team that opposite the one that touched it last. And that was a lot cheaper solution than building a cage.
Yeah, I thought it was partially too with fans throwing bottles into the car. I know that was happening with the.
Yeah, and that's also true. Especially in the early days, you didn't have gymnasiums, you know, huge rooms where you have, you know, probably from there to there between the court and the front row of seats. Those days, I mean, the seats would be right on the court. And well, we see it in baseball, of course, people reaching over into the field of play or into the court, interfering with the game. So that was also another reason why they built those cages.
Subject just a little bit.
Sure.
You talked about them having to pay for transportation.
Yeah.
Do you know of any time, has there ever been an abbreviation? I mean, we always hear about the March snow blizzard, you know, snowstorm tournament blizzards.
Yeah.
Has there ever been a tournament that was either delayed, postponed, teams not able to make it, so they, you know, they didn't participate?
Yeah.
Has weather ever been a major impact?
Yeah. You know, I'm not sure about Minnesota hoops here. I'm not sure if I wrote about that in Minnesota hoops. I have written a history of high school basketball. I haven't got a publisher yet, so it's not published. There's a chapter about the state tournament blizzard, and that was a very real thing. It seemed like every other year, at least, maybe not every year, but there would be a huge blizzard. But amazingly enough, there was never a case where the blizzard caused the postponement or cancellation of any game. There were times when, in fact, in 1951, was a very snowy year, and Canby, way out in the western part of the state, their regional final was delayed until Saturday night before and nowadays the regions or sections are required to finish up, I think, on Friday. They played their last game on Saturday in St. Peter, but they could not get from St. Peter to Canby. They were stuck in the snow for a couple of days. They finally got home on, I think, Tuesday. Well, then they had to be at the tournament on Wednesday to play a game on Thursday. They were, I think, the first team that ever, remember that banquet that they had in Carleton? Well, I don't know if they still do that today. Back in the 50s and 60s, they did it. I think Canby was the first team that ever missed the banquet because they couldn't get back to Minneapolis until late on Wednesday night. But no game was ever canceled or postponed, amazingly enough.
What about influence of referees on the game?
Yeah, that's a good question. It would take somebody probably smarter than me to answer that, and until and it's probably too late for it to happen. You know, who refereed back in the 20s and 30s, or referees, they call the game, but they don't talk. You know, they keep their their mouths shut. They keep their knowledge to themselves, I think, as a generalization. And the only thing I can say is that in the 1930s, for example, I said that coaches put in a lot of strategy, and a lot of that was to play slow and hold on to the ball. The state records, both in the state tournament and during the regular season, for the fewest fouls ever called in a game, I'm not aware that there has ever in the history of Minnesota been a high school game in which no fouls were called. But the state record for the fewest fouls called was 1. And that happened 3 or 4 times in the 1930s. So clearly the game was pretty passive. But I don't know if that also means that they let a lot of grabbing, let a lot of stuff go by. I do not know. And the fact that the scores were low and teams shot 20%, well, maybe they let a lot of grabbing and clutching go by. I don't know. That's a really good question, and I don't think we'll ever know.
When did the jump shot become popular?
Very good question. In 1937, the jump ball after every basket was abandoned, and everybody abandoned it right now. High schools, colleges, professionals, everybody. And everyone was thrilled, and especially spectators. Now there would be more continuous action. And now suddenly, if you were a coach, especially one that played a defensive style of game, well, you could no longer aspire to shut your opponents out. They were going to get the ball. They were going to get their chance. And so it was at that time that coaches realized, well, we got to score more points. We got to shoot better than 20%. So the jump shot became popular in the late 30s. The fast break became popular in the early 40s, and the low post became popular by the mid 40s. Now, the low post, part of that was that all of a sudden you had big, tall players. George Mikan was 6'10". Bob Kurland at Oklahoma State was 7'1". They won 2 NCAA championships. in the Minnesota State Tournament, the tallest player that had ever played in the tournament through, I believe, 1944 was 6'5". He was from Thief River Falls way back in 1932, I think. But suddenly, and in Minnesota, you had Jim McIntyre at Minneapolis Patrick Henry. He was 6'9". They won 2 state championships. He became an All-American at the University of Minnesota. So for some reason, and somebody, again, who's a lot smarter than me, could maybe tell us, was there some really significant fundamental change in nutrition and health? What was going on? Suddenly in the 1940s, you had 6'6", 6'8", 6'10", 7 feet. You'd never had that before. And so now the low post, of course, became the most popular offensive strategy, but also the fast break and the jump shot all became popular there in the 1940s. Because you had to score.
I think in those early days, if you were a 6'9" player, you were a freak.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And you would not have had maybe the social interaction, going on, the opportunities coming your way to turn that body into an athlete.
Right. Yeah, you're saying if there were guys that high, that tall prior to the 40s. Yeah. And it's possible that they were out there, they just weren't athletes. And that I don't know. But in basketball, just suddenly there was, yeah, exactly, right, yeah. And of course, if they were farm kids, up until the 50s, and even in my day, in the 60s, farm kids, by and large, at the end of the school day, they got in the bus and they went home because the family needed their labor on the farm. And so it was very rare for farm kids to play sports before, maybe the 60s, though there were cases, but it was rare.
I didn't go through that.
Yeah, okay.
He was lucky. Elementary school, I was one-room school for about a mile.
Where did you grow up?
Dassel.
Dassel? Okay. Yeah.
Collinwood was my elementary school.
Yeah, okay. And you played athletics in school? Yeah, okay.
4 athletics.
And what year was that?
66 is when I graduated.
Yeah, okay.
He had uncle who was very athletic, so that was an influence.
Yeah.
He would come to milk cows with my dad, and we'd go up in the hayloft and we'd shoot baskets and play one-on-one and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, and I think by the 60s that was beginning to happen, but certainly in the 30s and 40s, you just didn't see farm kids playing basketball or other extracurriculars.
I was fortunate because my dad and my uncle were farming together, and I could get time.
So your uncle did the work that you might otherwise have been asked to do.
My uncle was a better player than I was.
Yeah. Well, can I tell you one more story?
Sure.
Up in Boston, and of course Boston won that championship, and I read a lot of issues of the 13 towns. Well, Boston was, along with initially selling goods to the Native American Reservation and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, people in the Boston area also were potato farmers. They grew potatoes, and by the way, it was in that same school year, 1912, 1913, the Minnesota legislature passed a law that said kids would be required to go to school. It had been optional previous to that. And probably the average kid in Boston prior to 1913 came to school in the winter, but the fall and the spring, forget about it. They were working on the farm. And there are the superintendent of schools had a little column in the newspaper every week. And over and over and over again, he would say, please, can you get your kids to school? And, and just a great many kids were missing half of the year or more. In 1913, suddenly you had to send your kids to school, except the legislature passed the law, but that law would be enforced at the local level. Well, the local gendarmes were loath to go out and bang on somebody's door and arrest somebody because their kids weren't in school. They just didn't do it. So the idea of kids going to school every day, it caught on fairly slowly. And one of the ironies is that one of the players on Boston's championship team, a fellow named Joel Fogelberg, and not to embarrass the Fogelbergs or anything, but he was named in the newspaper as one of those students who was missing because they said, well, we presume he's at home picking potatoes, but please, he should be in school. Well, he played for the basketball team in the tournament, and it's entirely possible that if they had enforced the rules, that he might not have been eligible to play. But I don't know that. But the idea of compulsory education was new in 1913, highly controversial. Though eventually it pretty much carried the day, but that took some time.
Wasn't that only through 8th grade?
No, it was definitely, in 1913, it was definitely high schools as well, yeah.
One last question, and then I want to wrap it up so we
Sure.
have time to talk to Mark. We also have his books for sale as well, so out of all of the teams, all of the players, all of the places, favorite to watch?
And what time frame? Any time frame. Oh, probably my favorite team is still the Bethlehem Academy Cardinals. That's who I played for. And as I said, one the first basketball games I ever saw in person was Bethlehem Academy Cardinals. And of course they had, I'm sorry, our Cardinal red was redder than that. And as about a 9-year-old or an 8-year-old, I mean the excitement and it was just mind-boggling. And as Emily mentioned, I wanted to be like them. That was so thrilling. By the same token, then I watched, and my dad died when I was young. He died in 1967 at the age of 56. But from 1958 to 1966, I would watch the high school tournament on television. Well, in those days, you could not get a ticket. It was the most popular sporting event in the whole state of Minnesota. You could not go, but it was on television. And I sat and watched that with my dad, and those are some great, great memories as well. But I also had Gopher men's tickets for 25 years. My favorite team, if one team could win the ultimate championship for whatever, wherever it's at, it wouldn't be the Timberwolves. It wouldn't even be the Gopher men or women. It would be the Bethlehem Academy Cardinals. They did finish second one year back in 1992, I think. I would still wish for them to win a state championship. Now their girls finished third in the state in 2013, I think. That was very thrilling for me, and I was able to go to the games and watch those games. So my high school is still my favorite team. I graduated in 68, 56 years ago. Still my favorite team. Well, thank you. Thanks, everyone.